On a freezing morning in the winter of 1902, a man picked up a crowbar and walked toward a palace he had been paid to destroy. And he was not the first person that year to try to tear this city apart. Look closely at what he's about to break, because every building around him had been sentenced to death before it was ever built. Hold on to that idea. It is the key to everything that follows. Only months earlier, this had been one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Not a building, a city. 350 acres of palaces and towers and canals, painted in every color imaginable, wired with roughly 200,000 electric lights, crowned by a tower that rose nearly 400 feet into the sky and glowed at night with power carried in from Niagara Falls. Millions of people came to see it. For 6 months it shone, and then, within a year of the day it opened, men exactly like the one with the crowbar smashed almost every inch of it into rubble. That was always the plan. The people who designed this city built it on purpose, out of a material meant to be broken. They knew, as they raised each glowing palace, that it was temporary, that it existed to be seen, and then erased on schedule. But the tidy version of this story leaves 3 things out, and I want you to carry all 3 with you, because the record answers every one of them. The first, why would anyone build an entire city just to destroy it? The second, in the 6 short months this place was alive, something happened inside it that turned a monument to the future into the site of one of the darkest days in American history. And the third, the strangest one, when the end came, and hundreds of buildings were pulled down into the mud, exactly one was spared. One building, out of all of it, was allowed to survive. Keep that building in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to it, and the reason it lived tells you what this whole city really was. This is the story of the Rainbow City. It opened in Buffalo, New York, in the spring of 1901, and it was officially called the Pan-American Exposition. But almost no one called it that. They called it the Rainbow City, and the name was deliberate. 8 years earlier, Chicago had built the famous White City. Acres of gleaming white palaces that had taught America what a World's Fair was supposed to look like. Buffalo set out to do the opposite. Instead of white, they drenched their buildings in color. Deep reds, blues, greens, and golds, arranged so the tones grew softer and paler as your eye traveled inward, toward the center of the grounds, toward the single structure everything else had been built to frame. That structure was the electric tower. It rose nearly 400 feet into the air, and at night it did something almost no one standing in that crowd had ever seen in their lives. It lit up, not with gas, not with oil lamps or candles, which is how most of the people in that crowd still lit their own homes. The tower, and the palaces around it, were outlined in roughly 200,000 small electric bulbs. As darkness fell each evening, they were brought up slowly, section by section, until the entire city stood burning with cold electric light against a black sky. People who had grown up reading by candlelight stood in the dark and watched a city ignite. And the power did not come from Buffalo. It came from Niagara Falls, about 25 miles away, carried into the city on high-voltage lines using the new alternating current system. In a sense, the whole exposition was one enormous advertisement, proof that the raw force of the falls could be captured, sent across open country, and turned into light on command. To a visitor in 1901, this wasn't decoration. It was the future, switched on in front of their eyes. Now hold that image, the glowing tower, the colored palaces, electricity pulled out of a waterfall. And look at what those palaces were actually made of. They were made of plaster. The buildings of the Rainbow City were not built of stone or steel. They were built of a material called staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber, spread over ordinary wooden frames. Staff could be molded into columns and arches and sculpted figures. Painted and lit, from a few feet away it looked exactly like carved marble. But it was never meant to last. It was a skin, a stage set, built at the scale of a city, and everyone who raised it understood that when the fair closed it would come down. This was not a Buffalo invention. The White City in Chicago had been built the same way, out of the same kind of staff. The grand, European-style palaces that defined the American World's Fair were, almost all of them, temporary illusions. Beautiful surfaces stretched over lumber, designed to stand for a single season and then vanish. So there is your first answer, and it only deepens the mystery. The most advanced technology on the planet, electricity drawn from Niagara, was being housed inside buildings that were, in plain terms, disposable. The future was real. The city that showed it off was a stage set with an expiration date. Once you see that contradiction, you start to find it everywhere in the record. Take the money. The exposition cost somewhere around $7 million to build, an enormous sum for the time. Its planners were sure the crowds would more than pay it back. Some early projections ran into the tens of millions of visitors. The crowds did not come. The summer of 1901 was unusually cold and wet, and people stayed home. By the time the gates closed for good on the 2nd of November, only about 8 million people had passed through them, far fewer than the fair needed to survive. When the accounts were finally settled, the Pan-American Exposition had closed with a deficit of around $3 million. As a business, the Rainbow City was already a failure. But money is not what broke this place. That happened on a single afternoon in September, inside a building near the electric tower called the Temple of Music. This is the second thing I asked you to remember. On the 6th of September, 1901, the President of the United States, William McKinley, came to the Pan-American Exposition. He was popular, recently re-elected, and he had come to do one of the ordinary things a president did: stand in a reception line inside the Temple of Music and shake hands with the public who had gathered to see him. A young man named Leon Zalgas waited in that line. In his hand, wrapped in a handkerchief so that it looked like a bandage, was a revolver. When he reached the president, he fired twice. McKinley did not die at once. For several days it seemed he might recover, and the country held its breath. But the wounds turned. Infection set in. And on the 14th of September, 8 days after he was shot, the president was dead. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was rushed to Buffalo and sworn in as President of the United States. Not in Washington, but a short carriage ride from the fairgrounds themselves. Think about what that did to the place we started in. The Rainbow City had been raised as a monument to progress, to electricity, to the bright new century that had just begun. And in the space of 8 days it became, permanently, the place where an American president was murdered. The dazzling tower and the colored palaces were now the backdrop to a national tragedy. Whatever spell the fair had cast drained out of it in those September days, and it never came back. The crowds who came afterward came quieter and fewer. The record is clear on all of this. The dates, the names, the sequence, none of it is in dispute. What is stranger is what the crowd did at the very end. The final day of the exposition was the 2nd of November. The organizers named it Buffalo Day and made one last effort to fill the grounds. Around 125,000 people came, and then as that last night wore on, some of that crowd turned on the city itself. According to accounts written at the time, people began pulling the exposition apart with their bare hands. Windows were smashed. The light bulbs, the very bulbs that had made this place a wonder, were torn out of their sockets and thrown to the ground. Statues were pulled down. Fixtures were pried loose and carried off into the dark. The Rainbow City, on its final evening, was partly wrecked by the same public that had come to celebrate it. They were only a few months ahead of the professionals. Within days, a firm arrived from Chicago to negotiate. It was called the Chicago House Wrecking Company, and it specialized in exactly this: buying the bones of finished World's Fairs and selling them off for parts. And this was not the company's first time. Years earlier, it had handled the great Ferris wheel from Chicago's White City, the towering wheel from the 1893 fair. The same firm that had helped erase one dream city was now coming for another. After months of wrangling among the exposition's creditors, the deal closed. In February of 1902, the Chicago House Wrecking Company bought the buildings of the entire Pan-American Exposition, the palaces, the courts, the towers, the whole Rainbow City, for $80,000. A city that had cost around $7 million to build was sold, as scrap and salvage, for barely 1% of that. In March, the wrecking began, which brings us back to the man with the crowbar. When the whistle blew that morning, roughly 200 workmen went to work, and on every working day after that they did not stop until it was done. The buildings came down in pairs. The plaster columns were broken up. The sculpted figures, the goddesses, the allegories of light and progress, were smashed and carted away. For weeks afterward, People who wandered out to the old grounds found them littered with the rubble of broken columns, statuary, lampposts, and carvings, lying in the mud where a glowing city had stood the autumn before. The canals were filled in. The land was cleared, surveyed, and cut into streets and house lots. Today, if you go to that part of Buffalo, you will find quiet residential blocks, houses, driveways, ordinary streets, laid out over the ground where the Rainbow City once burned with electric light. A small marker notes the spot on a residential street where a president was shot. And now we come back to the third thing, the one building that lived. Out of hundreds of palaces and pavilions, one survived, and it is still standing today. It was the building put up by the state of New York, and the state of New York had done something none of the others did. It built its pavilion out of marble. Not staff, not plaster over lumber. Marble, because from the very beginning, New York's building was never meant to be part of the illusion. It was the only structure on those grounds designed to outlast the fair. The one building that was not sentenced to death before it was born. And so, when everything around it was smashed into salvage, it simply remained. Today, that marble building is the Buffalo History Museum, the last solid piece of a city that was designed, from its first day, to disappear. The one thing that was allowed to survive is the one thing that was never built to die. And that is the pattern worth sitting with. The thing the record actually shows, once you stop treating the Rainbow City as a single strange event and start seeing it as one example of something much larger. The Great American World's Fairs were not cities. They were the appearance of cities. They were vast and beautiful and deliberately temporary, full-scale stage sets in plaster and lumber, wired with the newest technology on Earth, and engineered to be torn down almost the moment they were finished. The White City of 1893 was built of staff and was largely gone within a couple of years. The Rainbow City of 1901 was built of staff and was gone within one. The same wrecking company carried away pieces of both. The future they advertised was real. The cities that advertised it never were. We remember these fairs as golden moments, the dawn of electricity, the hopeful turn of a new century. And that is true. But it is only the lit surface. Underneath was plaster and wood, a mountain of debt, a murdered president, and a crew of 200 men, paid by the day, whose entire job was to make certain that none of it lasted. So the record leaves one question open. When a nation builds something dazzling to show the world its future, and knows, even as it builds, that it intends to destroy that thing within months, what is it really celebrating? The progress itself? Or only the performance of it? The man with the crowbar probably never asked. It was a job, and there was another building on the list. When he was done with the palace in front of him, he moved to the next one. And the light of the Rainbow City went out for the last time. Not in a blaze, but quietly, one plaster wall at a time. Everything around him would be gone by summer. Everything except a single building of marble, still standing there today, waiting for someone to walk in and ask why it was the only one they let live.